While fans swooned over Hollywood's golden couples, the truth behind the silver screen was far darker. Studios didn't just nudge stars toward romance, they forced them into fake weddings, threatening to destroy careers if they refused. Some chose love over millions, walking away from fame. Now let's uncover the shocking stories behind the stars who paid the highest price. Behind the glamorous smiles, secrets festered. Deals were made in shadows. Imagine this. It's 1926, and Greta Garbo isn't just a movie star, she's a full-blown obsession. The mysterious Swedish beauty who barely speaks to the press, never smiles in public, and drives men absolutely insane with her silence. Fans worship her. Studios cash in on her. Paparazzi follow every step she takes. And MGM will do anything, literally anything, to keep her image perfect. There was just one problem. Garbo wasn't interested in men. According to multiple Hollywood insiders, she was secretly in love with writer Mercedes de Acosta, a woman who was well known in elite lesbian circles at the time. They exchanged letters, locked themselves away in private hotel suites, and were reportedly seen walking hand in hand behind the studio lot. It was one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets, and MGM knew it. That same year, as whispers started leaking into the press and journalists began asking uncomfortable questions, MGM made a decision. Not a suggestion, not a negotiation, a decision. They would arrange a fake wedding to erase the rumors. The chosen groom, John Gilbert, Hollywood's most desired heartthrob. A man so popular the press literally described him as every woman's dream. MGM turned the whole thing into a marketing campaign. Magazine covers, radio hype, tabloids printing a timeline of their secret love affair. An official press release from MGM announcing the date of the ceremony. Except none of it was real. According to studio documents and several people who worked on set, MGM never even bothered asking Garbo if she wanted to get married. They simply wrote the story, shipped out the invitations, ordered the cake, hired the photographers, and booked the chapel. All Garbo had to do was show up. Smile and kiss her brand new husband in front of the cameras. Problem solved, career protected, rumors erased. Only, that's not what happened. On the morning of the wedding, while John Gilbert stood nervously in a perfectly tailored tuxedo and camera crews were waiting inside the chapel, Greta Garbo vanished. She left her house before sunrise and disappeared. No assistant, no press agent, no studio driver, no explanation at all. Just gone. One MGM publicist later admitted she refused to become part of the studio's little fairy tale. With no bride in sight, the entire event collapsed in front of stunned journalists. People were whispering in the pews. Reporters didn't know whether to leave or keep the cameras rolling. MGM panicked and tried to lie their way out of it by claiming she was too sick to attend. But only a week later, Garbo reportedly told a close friend, "I will not stand in front of the world and pretend to love someone I don't." And she meant it. From that day forward, she refused every single publicity romance the studio tried to invent for her. No more fake boyfriends, no more staged engagements, no more photo ops with handsome leading men. She chose silence and her truth over the most powerful studio in the world. And here's the terrifying part. That failed wedding wasn't just embarrassing. It was proof that Hollywood was willing to create entire marriages just to hide the sexuality of its biggest stars. So if they were willing to do that to Greta Garbo, what do you think they did to everyone else? Hollywood loved to sell the perfect love story. Tall, handsome, masculine, adored by millions of women, Rock Hudson was that story. Movie posters called him the ultimate romantic hero. Studios flooded theaters with images of him holding his on-screen girlfriends in the rain, kissing them in candlelight, sweeping them off their feet. But behind all the carefully staged kisses and perfect close-ups, Rock Hudson was living a very different reality. He was gay, and the studio knew it. According to multiple studio insiders and several biographers, Hudson's private life was an open secret inside Hollywood. He dated men quietly and attended private parties where photographers weren't allowed. But in the eyes of 1950s America, homosexuality wasn't just controversial. It was career-destroying. Then came the summer of 1955. A tabloid called Confidential magazine threatened to publish a bombshell story exposing Hudson's private relationships. The editors claimed to have first-hand proof and were preparing to run it nationwide. To Universal Studios, this wasn't gossip. It was a total disaster. Hudson was their golden boy, their box office machine, the visual definition of all-American masculinity. So the studio did what old Hollywood always did when the truth got too close. They staged a marriage. Hudson's agent quickly arranged a last-minute relationship with Hudson's own secretary, Phyllis Gates. With almost no notice, the couple was rushed into a private wedding. No questions, no time for interviews, just a photographer, a courthouse, and a front-page story the very next morning. Rock Hudson shocks fans with secret marriage. In public, it looked like a fairy tale. But in private, the marriage barely existed. Several of Hudson's close friends recall that he rarely came home after the wedding. The studio continued to arrange photo shoots of the couple, smiling at premieres, walking on the beach, sitting in fancy restaurants, every single moment carefully staged. At one point, Phyllis Gates even confronted him directly and asked whether he was attracted to men, but he stayed silent and refused to answer. 3 years later, the marriage ended quietly. No real scandal. No explosive breakup. It simply fell apart right after the rumor disappeared. The lie, however, stayed alive for decades. Then in 1985, Rock Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS. He tried to keep it private, but the truth eventually surfaced and shocked the entire world. For the first time, audiences realized that one of Hollywood's most beloved romantic icons had spent his entire life hiding who he really was, while the studio protected the illusion it built around him. And honestly, that raises a much bigger question. How many of those perfect Hollywood love stories were real, and how many were just part of the cover-up? He was Hollywood's original sex symbol, the man entire theaters screamed for in the 1920s. Newspapers called him the Latin lover and claimed women were fainting just from watching him on screen. To the public, Rudolph Valentino was every woman's fantasy. Behind the curtain, he was becoming Hollywood's prisoner. Inside the industry, people whispered that Valentino wasn't as heterosexual or masculine as the studios wanted him to be. Some believed he was bisexual. Others claimed he had no interest in the publicity-driven relationships the studio kept arranging for him. But one thing was clear: his image had to stay perfect. So the studio took control, the same way it always did. They arranged a wedding. The bride was Jean Acker, an actress who, according to many Hollywood insiders, was involved in relationships with women off-screen. There was no real courtship, just an announcement and an immediate ceremony. It was supposed to silence the rumors. Instead, it created one of the most humiliating moments in Hollywood history. On their wedding night, Acker locked Valentino out of their hotel room. He stood in the hallway, knocking, begging to be let in. She never opened the door. The marriage was never consummated. The next morning, the studio fed the press a ridiculous love story, while Valentino quietly wrote her emotional letters, confused and heartbroken. Several reporters later called it the most tragic wedding night Hollywood had ever seen. Hollywood didn't care about his humiliation. What they cared about was keeping control. When critics began calling him too feminine and newspaper columns started using the nickname the Pink Powder Puff, the executives panicked again. Their solution? Stage a second marriage. This time with costume designer Natasha Rambova. Ironically, she had already been in a relationship with another woman. According to studio insiders, Valentino was warned that refusing the second marriage would cost him every leading role he had left. Nothing about the romance was real. Not the press photos, not the honeymoon stories, not the headlines about Hollywood's most passionate couple. By 1925, the second marriage had collapsed, and Valentino's public image went with it. He tried to defend himself in interviews, insisting the rumors weren't true, but the damage was already done. 2 fake marriages, a reputation ruined by gossip, a man pressured into hiding his true identity until the day he died alone at the age of just 31. Thousands of fans cried at his funeral, never realizing they had fallen in love with a fantasy manufactured by the studio system. So let me ask you, was Rudolph Valentino really the world's greatest lover? Or just another victim of Hollywood's brutal reputation machine? In the late 1930s, Barbara Stanwyck was untouchable. Critics called her the most powerful woman in Hollywood. She played strong, independent characters on screen, and off camera, she built a reputation for being fiercely private, almost guarded. But in a town where privacy usually meant you had something to hide, the gossip machine started to turn. Reporters began whispering, "Why hasn't she ever been seen with a man? Why don't the tabloids have a single story about her dating life?" One article even implied that she might be too masculine for traditional romance, a dangerous suggestion in 1938. Studio executives panicked. At the time, one rumor was all it took to destroy a star. So MGM made a decision. Barbara needed a husband. They didn't waste time. The studio contacted Robert Taylor, a young, handsome actor who also happened to be facing whispers about his private life. He was told the marriage would be mutually beneficial. He agreed. Overnight, every magazine in America began talking about Hollywood's newest love story. They claimed Stanwyck and Taylor had fallen in love on set, had dinner in secret, and had been hiding their relationship for months to avoid attention. None of it was true. The wedding was planned by the studio publicity department, right down to the location, the dress, even the guest list. When the big day finally arrived, Stanwyck looked like she was walking onto a film set rather than into a marriage. It only got worse. According to multiple witnesses, Taylor refused to kiss her during the ceremony. Instead of celebrating afterward, he simply thanked the guests, left the reception early, and went straight to his mother's house. Stanwyck spent her wedding night alone. One friend later said, "She didn't look like a bride, she looked like an actress doing press." And that was exactly what she was. For over 10 years, the two lived separate lives, sharing only public appearances carefully arranged by MGM. Every romantic outing photographed by the press had been scheduled in advance. In private, they slept in separate rooms, traveled separately, and rarely spoke to each other. The studio didn't care if they were unhappy. As long as the public believed the story, the machine kept moving. In 1950, Stanwyck quietly asked for a divorce. Taylor didn't argue. There was no fight, no statement, no emotion, just silence. And the quiet end of a marriage that had never really existed in the first place. Which leaves one uncomfortable truth. Sometimes Hollywood didn't ruin love stories. It built fake ones from scratch and forced people to live inside them. Hard to believe this was considered normal, isn't it? And it makes you wonder, how many other stars were trapped in scripts they never wrote? The camera flash exploded across the front page. Anthony Perkins stood next to a beautiful woman in a white wedding dress, smiling quietly like the romantic leading man Hollywood insisted he was. fans were stunned. "Psycho star marries," the headline screamed. It looked spontaneous. It looked romantic. But according to crew members who worked with him, the wedding photo felt more like a carefully staged movie scene. Every gesture rehearsed, every angle pre-approved by the studio's publicity team. Because long before that photo existed, Anthony Perkins had already been in love. Not with a woman, but with another man. In the late 1950s, Perkins had a relationship with actor Tab Hunter that almost everyone in Hollywood already knew about. They hosted parties together. They showed up holding hands at private events. They shared an apartment. It wasn't a rumor. It was his real life. All of that disappeared the moment Psycho exploded into a national obsession. Suddenly, Perkins was no longer just an actor. He was a product, and the public expected that product to be perfectly straight. At first, the pressure was subtle. A friendly suggestion to skip certain events. A quiet reminder from a studio assistant that his friendships with other men were being talked about in the press. Then came the staged sightings, dinners with female co-stars, the paparazzi tip-offs that magically caught him just leaving a romantic restaurant. But the whispers didn't stop, and Hollywood only knows one way to kill a rumor: invent a bigger lie. Overnight, gossip columns suddenly began mentioning Perkins's secret romance with photographer Barry Berenson. Within weeks, without a single photo of them ever having been together before, an official wedding was announced. People were shocked, but the studio wasn't. They had written the story themselves. It looked perfect, which is exactly what made it terrifying. Friends later said Perkins cried the night before the ceremony, terrified that this would be the moment he'd have to say goodbye to the person he really was. After the wedding, he stopped attending parties entirely. He avoided being alone in public. In every interview, he answered questions about love with the same polite, empty smile. One person who knew him at the time said, he wasn't lying, he had simply stopped speaking. He stayed that way for the rest of his life. Even when he was diagnosed with AIDS in 1990, he refused to let the truth come out, afraid the studio-built version of himself would collapse in front of the world. He died in 1992, still playing the role Hollywood had assigned him decades earlier. Not the villain, not the heartthrob, just a man who had to act even when the cameras weren't rolling. And that's the real horror story no one ever paid to watch. The cameras flashed. Judy Garland stood in her wedding dress, smiling softly as she placed her hand on Vincente Minnelli's arm. To the public, it looked like the perfect Hollywood love story, the beloved starlet marrying the brilliant director who understood her like no one else. What the audience didn't know was that every single second of it had been rehearsed. The truth was much colder. Long before that wedding photo, Vincente Minnelli had already lived another life. In New York's theater world, he was known for his bold style, pink silk shirts, and long-term relationships with other men. He never hid it until he signed with MGM. The day he arrived in Hollywood, everything changed. According to internal studio records, he received a memo advising him to avoid overly expressive clothing and to limit private socializing with male companions. Publicists began closely monitoring his appearances. Executives even instructed him to change the way he walked and spoke in interviews. Rumors kept spreading anyway, so the studio decided to eliminate the rumors the only way Hollywood knew how. They offered him a bride. Judy Garland was the ideal solution. She was already America's sweetheart. She already carried the image of innocence. And most importantly, she already knew who Minnelli really was. Studio insiders later claimed Garland agreed because she understood how dangerous the truth could be. After all, She had been placed on amphetamines at age 16 to stay slim for the cameras. She knew exactly what Hollywood did to anyone who stepped outside the script. The wedding looked like something out of a musical. Imported flowers, perfectly timed lighting, matching white outfits. The photographers didn't capture the moment. They were scheduled for it. Inside the house, reality appeared almost instantly. Minnelli and Garland slept in different bedrooms from the very first week. During production of The Pirate, Garland reportedly walked in on Minnelli with another man. She collapsed in tears. MGM's immediate response was not to protect her. It was to sedate her, dress her, and push her back in front of the camera. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time she begged to stop filming. Studio executives didn't hesitate. They threatened to suspend her and blacklist her if she refused to finish the movie. By 1951, she couldn't play along anymore. Garland filed for divorce. Minnelli signed the papers without a fight. No public scandal, no apology. Just another Hollywood marriage quietly erased from the script, as if it had never existed at all. The public believed the fairy tale. The real story disappeared behind a headline that had been written before the wedding even took place. And that may be the most disturbing part. In old Hollywood, the danger wasn't on screen. It was behind the scenes, where every secret had a price and every lie became someone's life. In the 1940s, no actor drew bigger crowds than Tyrone Power. He was the studio's most bankable star, a swashbuckling hero, a war veteran, a man whose name alone was enough to sell out theaters. The press called him the embodiment of male desire. But inside Hollywood, people were whispering something else. Behind closed doors, Power was rumored to have had intense relationships with several male actors, most notably Cesar Romero. They were seen together at private gatherings, sharing hotel suites on European trips, and disappearing from film sets for days at a time. According to several people on the lot, one private photo of the two men reportedly sparked panic among executives and was immediately destroyed. For years, the studio managed to bury the stories. Then one day, the whispers got too loud. Columnists began openly questioning his private life. Executives panicked. Power was called into a private office and quietly warned that the next rumor to hit the front page could end his entire career. Soldier, hero, and all. Power knew exactly what that meant, so he did what he thought might save him. He chose a bride. French actress Annabella was smart, elegant, and enormously respected. Most importantly, she had no connection to the gay rumors already circling Power. He married her quickly, before the studio could force him into something even more controlled. But instead of helping, the marriage turned into another script he had to perform. Studio publicists immediately began promoting it as Hollywood's most beautiful love story. They staged interviews, photo shoots, carefully written letters published in magazines. Annabella played along because she loved him. Power tried to play along too, but the truth didn't disappear. He continued meeting Cesar Romero in secret. He even took a 6-week vacation to South America with him, while still married, and reporters who followed them were quietly paid off or reassigned before anything made it to print. People on set started using a new nickname behind his back: the leading man who always disappears with the wrong person. By 1946, the marriage had fallen apart. Annabella confronted him repeatedly. According to friends, she once asked him whether he even knew who he was anymore. Power couldn't answer. They separated that same year. The studio spun it as a tragic distance caused by work commitments. Fans believed every word. Some even sent flowers to the studio to show support for his heartbreak. Nobody realized the real heartbreak was happening for a reason he was never allowed to say out loud. Because in Hollywood, falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just dangerous. It could turn even the most powerful man alive into someone who spent his whole life running. If you were in his place, would you have chosen love or survival? Sometimes the answer says more about us than we think. Champagne gigs at midnight. Broadway stars gathered in hidden salons. Cole Porter sitting at the piano, improvising new melodies, while young dancers draped themselves over velvet chairs and laughed at jokes too scandalous to print. For years, his parties weren't parties. They were events whispered about across 2 continents. Everyone knew Porter preferred the company of men. Everyone also knew he wrote some of the most romantic love songs in American history. It was a contradiction, and people loved it. But when Night and Day exploded nationwide and Porter became more than just a composer, when he became a national celebrity, that contradiction suddenly turned dangerous. According to people in his circle, certain theater donors started expressing concern about persistent rumors. A radio sponsor privately claimed the public loved Cole's music but might not accept his private lifestyle. And then came the studio note. The songs are perfect. The image needs adjusting. That's when Porter made a decision that stunned even his closest friends. He proposed, but not for love. Linda Lee Thomas was elegant, wealthy, and respected in every high society circle that mattered. Most importantly, she understood that Porter's proposal wasn't romantic. It was strategic. They married in Paris in 1919 in front of nobility and press. The event was so flawless that one newspaper called it a wedding worthy of royalty. But a longtime friend later confessed that the celebration felt eerily controlled, like a beautifully staged show. After the wedding, the myth began. Porter and Linda became the definition of sophistication. Interviews described them as inseparable. Magazines published posed photos of them sitting together at grand pianos, staring into each other's eyes. Behind the facade, things were very different. Porter continued seeing men, and Linda quietly protected him. She walked out of parties early when she knew Cole wanted to stay behind. She redirected suspicious guests, invented entire stories when someone showed up at the wrong time. One friend later said, she didn't marry him because she loved him. She loved him enough to let him live. It worked. The public believed the fairy tale and never bothered to look any closer. But every so often, the mask slipped. Like the night a journalist reportedly saw Porter holding a young man's hand in the hallway at 2 a.m. and the entire column mysteriously disappeared before print. Still, Porter never explained. Linda never betrayed him. And the lie became a permanent part of the legacy. They stayed together for 34 years. Not because it was a love story, but because it was the only story the world would accept. Some people say that's tragic. Others say it was genius. What do you think? When Mutiny on the Bounty premiered in 1935, audiences were stunned. Charles Laughton's performance as the brutal Captain Bligh wasn't just good, it was terrifying. Newspapers called him the most commanding male presence in cinema. To millions of people, he became the face of raw, uncompromising masculinity. Studio executives were thrilled. They had finally found the perfect alpha male star. But the man walking out of the premiere that night, surrounded by applause and flashing cameras, wasn't the man people thought he was. Because long before Hollywood claimed him, Charles Laughton had already lived another truth. Back in London, during his early days in the theater, he had quietly fallen in love with a young actor. It wasn't a secret among the company. People knew, and nobody judged him. But when he arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, that secret suddenly became dangerous. A studio executive allegedly warned him, "People love your talent. Don't give them a reason to look behind the curtain." Raised in a strict Catholic family, Laughton spent years trying to correct himself. He read religious texts. He tried dating women. He kept telling himself that it would eventually change. It didn't. And when he married actress Elsa Lanchester in 1929, he finally confessed the truth to her. Quietly, privately, ashamed. Instead of leaving, she simply sat down and said, "You don't need to lie to me." From that moment on, their marriage became something Hollywood didn't understand. A partnership, not a love story. Laughton threw himself into his work. Henry VIII, Quasimodo, Captain Bligh. Audiences couldn't get enough. And with every role, the studio leaned harder into the myth of Charles Laughton. Powerful, dominant, desirable. Meanwhile, at home, he could barely look at himself in the mirror. According to Elsa's memoir, Laughton went through long periods of silence and self-doubt. He refused to attend certain parties, terrified he would slip and expose the truth. He sometimes sat at the piano in the middle of the night, playing the same melody over and over until his hands shook. One night, as rumors began circulating again, the studio allegedly told Elsa, "Make sure he keeps his private life private. You know what would happen if people started asking the wrong questions." Elsa understood. She hosted dinners, smiled for photos. She even sat next to him during interviews, so he wouldn't have to answer difficult questions. They lived like that for decades. Two brilliant artists, trapped in a situation that protected them from the world, but kept them from being themselves. Elsa later wrote, "He wasn't ashamed of who he was. He was ashamed that he wasn't allowed to live it." They stayed married for more than 30 years, not because of romance, because of trust. Some people still call it a tragedy, others call it loyalty, but whatever it was never freedom. By 1930, William "Billy" Haines wasn't just a movie star. He was Hollywood's #1 box office draw. He had that rare combination of charm and confidence that made audiences fall in love the second he stepped on screen. But unlike so many of his colleagues, Haines never pretended to be someone he wasn't. Everyone in town knew he shared his home and his life with Jimmy Shields. They hosted elegant dinner parties behind tall hedges in Brentwood, invitation only, no press allowed. People whispered that it was the one place in town where everybody could finally be themselves. Hollywood knew. They just didn't talk about it. Until one night in 1933, when Haines was arrested in a YMCA room with a sailor. The next morning, studio head Louis B. Mayer summoned him without warning. Haines walked into the office thinking it would be a warning. Instead, Mayer leaned forward and said, "Marry a woman, now, or this town will spit you out." That wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. The same command every closeted star had quietly obeyed before him. But Haines didn't obey. He looked Mayer in the eye and said, "I'm already married." He wasn't talking about a publicity deal. He was talking about Jimmy. Mayer fired him immediately. Executives from rival studios cut off negotiations in a matter of hours. By the end of the week, it was like William Haines had never existed at all. Someone who worked in the publicity department later said, "We were told to eliminate his name from everything, upcoming films, press lists, even internal memos." Haines went home and told Jimmy what had happened. According to friends, Jimmy didn't ask him to reconsider or hide. He simply poured 2 drinks and said, "Then we start again." And they did. They opened an interior design company out of their house. At first, it sounded impossible. 2 former actors rebuilding their lives from scratch. But soon Hollywood's biggest names were secretly hiring them to transform their homes, inside the same town that had erased him. William Haines built a second career on his own terms. Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, they all used him. None of them forgot that he was the only one who had chosen love over lies. He and Jimmy stayed together for almost 50 years. When Haines died of lung cancer in 1973, Jimmy sat beside the bed and refused to leave the room for 3 days. 3 months later, unable to live without him, he took his own life and left a note that simply read, "I now find it impossible to go on alone." 2 graves, side by side. He lost everything the studio could take away, the fame, the roles, the money. But in the end, he became the one thing no one else in this story was allowed to be: free. Would you have made the same choice, even if it meant giving up everything? Hollywood built an empire on bright lights, perfect smiles, and stories that were never real. Behind those headlines weren't scandals, they were human beings, forced to trade freedom for survival. And the real question is, has anything truly changed? Or are we still living with the same lies, just in a different disguise? If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, or respect, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because Hollywood still has secrets left to tell. Because trust me, Hollywood still has a few secrets left.